One of the fascinations of hybridizing orchids is that one can set himself long-term goals that, species are species. It is whatness, quidditas, I am I, all eternity shivers with that sweet cry. But when one's hybridizing, one sees the potential to create new kinds of orchids and new genres, as it were, of orchids. That direction, that creation, it is a bit of a godlike thing, and we are a little lower than the angels in our ability to create and reshape the world around us. The thing that I typically do in the morning is breeding. I like to do my breeding early in the morning because I feel like the plants are more receptive in the cooler temperatures rather than in the heat of the day. So I will have typically picked out a plant or two that I want to breed with. I will then start to look at the plants that I have in bloom and think about the plants that I want to breed them to. We do extensively save pollen. We refrigerate the pollen from plants so that we can cross plants that bloom at different seasons. And that's a very successful thing to do because plants that are either long day or short day, when they're crossed together, they tend to become indeterminate, and that will produce plants that are flowering just about all the time. I grew up in South Florida, west of Miami, and there were hardwood hammocks that had orchids growing in them. And so I ended up being able to collect some orchids right there in my neighborhood. That's how I began, and when I earned a little pocket money, I was able to buy orchids, and there was an orchid grower that was only about 1.5 miles from our house. And from there, I kind of graduated on out into working with, at the time, there were numerous people bringing vast quantities of orchids from Central and South America in. We actually graduated to importing them ourselves from various places. I traveled to Jamaica, for example, and collected orchids in the wild. Opportunity to go to Peru. First time I left the country, I was working with a company that imported tropical fish out of Iquitos, Peru, and they were looking for something light to carry besides the water the fish was in and were in, and that was orchids. I ended up going down at just 16 years old to South America and all the way up the Amazon River so far that people no longer even spoke Spanish. That was an absolute formative experience that welded me to orchids and to tropical plants and to the tropics. I was able to start at Miami-Dade Community College in botany, and I did a couple of years of botany work there, but then I switched to English literature, and then the war in Vietnam drove me to continue on in English until I actually had a PhD, and that led to a professorship at Wright State University, and then ultimately to a Fulbright lectureship in Kosovo, where I met my wife. But I had the choice when that was over of either returning home to the tropics here in Florida or continuing on probably as a tenured professor at Wright State University. And I, of course, chose to leave everything behind there and come back home to Florida. I didn't know John LaRoche that well, but he was an interesting figure at the time. But I did know Sue Orlean and provided her with a great deal of the material for The Orchid Thief, and some of which she used, a lot of which I wish she had used. We started out with a very small greenhouse that we did a shade house that was out of a carport. And then we covered over part of it and started growing seedlings. I learned how to do flask orchids, and that's where the orchid business really began. We started producing our own seedlings. We didn't have a lot of money, but we had time and we had the energy, and we put it into producing these seedlings. It just gradually grew, it grew and grew. We were importing species from the Philippines and from India and from Thailand and selecting the best ones, both to reproduce as species and to use as parents. And over the course of 50 years, we have basically built up the finest breeding collection of Vanda orchids in the world. Orchids begin their life in a bottle. We say in vitro, in glass. The key to it is sugar. And because there's sugar in the media, the seeds need to be sown, they need to be sterilized or start out sterile from a green pod. And then we plant the seeds in the bottles. And then after several transplants, and about a year in the bottle, the seedlings are big enough to survive on their own outside. Then the next stage seems to be exceptionally difficult for people, taking them out of the bottles, and we do that exceptionally well. We lose probably less than 3 or 4% of our plants, and we grow them in flats, so we try to grow everything in as compact a space as possible. What fascinates me about orchids is their infinite variability. There are so many different types of orchids. They're based on one premise that I think is unique in orchid flowers, and they are bilaterally symmetrical, and human beings are bilaterally symmetrical. So I think at some deeper level there's an attraction between human beings and these flowers that are somehow formed in a human-like way. And that variations on the theme of that has always been the fascination for me. I feel like we have created so many wonderful things. We want to see them preserved and make them possibly available to other breeders. And that's what this lab is all about. Hopefully, before I go to the big greenhouse in the sky, I'm going to see lots and lots and lots more of my orchids bloom. But if I don't, I feel like I'm contributing something that can be continued on afterwards.